Hi, students. This is a little late for week one, and I totally get that, and I apologize. But I wanted to take an opportunity to go over some of the topics that our reading focused on for last week. And so for the first week of the class, I asked you to read chapter 1 of our intercultural counseling textbook. I want to go a little backwards and look at the preface. If you have an opportunity, I think it's a really good idea to read through the preface, or at least kind of skim through it, because it gives the author or the editors information and ideas on what sort of the logic behind the creation of the textbook was, and why they decided to create a textbook that is a little bit different than the typical textbooks you see for multicultural or diversity or cross-cultural counseling courses. And so one of the things that this does in addition is it definitely talks about emerging things that are kind of coming up, and ways that we need to move beyond cultural competence and really take a broader look at the spectrum. And so they talk about the way that they use different disciplines to pull together the information for the textbook, rather than solely focusing on the counseling field. And so it has what they call constructivist or constructionist foundations and decolonial threads throughout. One of the things that I wanted to point out is in the preface on, it would be Roman numeral page 17. They write, "You may not always agree with the arguments in this book. This is okay. We expect that. But we would invite you to at least consider the ideas we present in a culturally respectful way, to adopt a questioning stance in relation to accepted knowledge, and to test that knowledge." I apologize for that interruption. So it says to adopt a questioning stance in relation to accepted knowledge, and to test that knowledge against criteria that place cultural differences at the forefront. And so I think that this really highlights the focus of this course overall for the semester, is that there's going to be different things that come up that you may or may not agree with, and there's going to be things that you question and are unsure of, and that's okay. And I think that bringing those things to the forefront is really important, so that we can have dialogues on them. And as you'll be able to see, that again, another thread that kind of goes through this course is about being able to open up those dialogues and have conversations that may feel really difficult for us in some ways, but that are really necessary for us to do this work and to continue to really stretch ourselves and learn and grow. So again, the preface kind of continues with that. It goes through acknowledgments, and then we get to chapter 1, which was the focus for week 1. And so this is the challenges of bridging the us and them divide. And so it talks a little bit about a historical perspective of how we've sort of separated the us from the them, and it kind of talks a little bit about why, like from an evolutionary and anthropological perspective, why we have that, and how it has been used historically, and then how we continue to use it today, which I think really helps us to understand in some ways, people who maybe have customs or beliefs or values that are very different from ours. It can kind of help us to understand a little bit more. It also talks about our country as a society of immigrants, and because once upon a time when this country was quote found, discovered, that brought a whole host of immigrants to the country. And so while there were indigenous people who lived here, the first settlers came and basically murdered them and destroyed their cultures and their tribes and their customs and all of that stuff, and sort of took over. And then the country began to be ruled by and taken over by immigrants, some who wanted to come over, and that was their goal, and others were taken from the places they came from and forcefully kept here. And so this is not going to go away as far as our history is concerned, that really impacts the socio-political climate in our country, and it's something that we need to remember and really need to focus on. This chapter does go a little bit more into the purpose for the book and kind of the ideas, you know, and how it's set up and what they're hoping to get, you know, for readers to get out of it. And next it goes into tuning into the us and them and really being able to listen to both ourselves and others, and having a better understanding of how we can coexist and work together. Again, it goes into the defending of our categories and the ways in which we kind of perpetuate that us and them divide. Talks a lot about fear, which is a strong underlying component in the us and them divide, and I think that it's really important when we look at the ways in which we are different, and trying to understand people who may have different identities than ours, or intersections of identities than ours, and how important that factor of fear is, and the way that that really plays out in our other actions, whether we're sort of aware of it or willing to acknowledge it or not. It brings up the topic of bias, which is also really important. I want to link an article here on bias, if I can find it. But our biases are created for good reasons, right? So like we have to kind of put things into categories for our safety and security, those like basic human needs. And those biases help us to understand the world. But sometimes those biases work against us, and you know, give us kind of like those automatic reactions that that are not helpful or inaccurate. And so that kind of plays into the us and them divide, as far as us making assumptions about other people based on things that we've been told or things that we've learned, or whatever. And the important thing is to be able to be aware of those biases and recognize when they come up, and not to immediately act on them, to have that recognition of what that bias is and what it serves, and then to act out from a more conscious place. Talks about stigma and the way that it can accompany bias and stereotype. It's that negative response that we might have as a consequence of how we've categorized other people. And then it gets into dehumanization, which is sort of the next step. You know, we have biases automatically. We need to make sure we're not acting out and stigmatizing different groups and populations. And, you know, certainly we don't want to get to the point of dehumanization, which, when you think historically, really happened with the Nazis and the Jews. They perpetuated this idea that the Jewish people were less than human, and they talked about them in ways that were degrading. And it sort of made it, you know, okay for them to then discriminate against them, harm them, kill them, and basically allowed the Holocaust to occur, and how it got to that point. And so if you think about the ways in which, you know, some people today will talk about different groups of individuals and will label them in certain ways, and talk about them in ways that really paint an image that sometimes gets burned into people's brains. You know, they talk about immigrants in a very negative way. There will be people who talk about people of color in a very negative way, or females in a very negative way, LGBT individuals. You know, it's really across the board. And you know, it takes these already marginalized communities and identities, and tries to dehumanize them, so that, you know, the hope of those people that are presenting that information is as though that we can dehumanize them and make them less worthy of the rights and privileges that we, you know, all deserve as human beings, and kind of justify the inequities and injustices that are occurring. So again, like I said, this chapter then goes into a little bit more history of like witchcraft and things like that, and the way that was kind of, you know, based on the creation of an us and them narrative. ways in which the us and them narrative fails to look at the complexities of our lives and our identities and who we are. It gets into the new fault lines, which I talked about, like the identity politics and stuff. It gets into intersectionality, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in the semester as well, but it gives just a very brief introduction of it. And I have a very short video that has a construct of intersectionality and kind of speaks to that a little bit, that I'm going to post with this. It talks about the white working class identity in our country and why there is this, feeling in a lot of individuals in that identity group who feel like they're being marginalized and stigmatized and things like that. Gets deeper into the political identities and how, sort of the red and blue have become identities as well. And the shifts in that. Talks about, the idea of fake news, social media, digital identities, which is a really important thing as we consider the movement towards more and more technology and the importance of online communication and connection and things like that. At the end of this chapter, there are, one of the things that is at the end of every chapter I love is response to the chapter. So it takes an individual in the field, different people of different identities, and has them kind of give a little bit of a reflection on the chapter and how they feel like they might use it in, or how it's important in their day-to-day work as a counselor or in the counseling field. And so I really like that. But it also has some exercises at the end of the chapter that I want you to consider. And so the first exercise is to make a list of all the in-groups and out-groups you've been a part of in the past, or maybe are currently a part of, right? And so discuss some of, it says discuss in a group of 3. Obviously, we're doing this remotely. And so it would just be something to think about. Or maybe you could, connect with some of the people in the class, or even, other individuals, to work on it. But, think about the questions is, how did you get placed into those groups? Was it something that you were born with, like an identity that was innate? Or was it something that was put on you, or a label you took onto yourself? Like, how did those groups start to form? Which groups were you assigned to and which do you choose to belong to? What are the effects that you've noticed about being in those in-groups and out-groups? Did you move in and out of those in-groups and out-groups, or were they more static? Once in those groups, what led the charge when you left one or more of them? So, being in this group, what made you want to leave or want to be a part of another group? Did you ever want to get into one of those groups that you had the experience of kind of being barred from admission to that group? What advantages are there of being in the in-group, and what are the disadvantages? And I would probably say, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of being in the out-group? Kind of flip that on its head. But what are the counseling implications for counselors working with clients in an in-group? So think about yourself as a counselor and the in-groups and out-groups you're part of, and what would it be like to work with clients that are in some of those in-groups, maybe that you're a part of or ones that you're not a part of? What are the advantages then it goes into that question. What are the advantages of being in an out-group and the disadvantages, and what is it like for counselors to work with clients that are in out-groups? And I think that this is really one of the questions that you can think about now as we begin the semester, but is really important to really start to clarify as we work through the semesters. How do we work with individuals that might be considered to be in groups or out groups, and the nature of those in and out groups? Are they groups that they chose to be in, or groups that they were placed in, or how did those groups come to be, and what is it like for us, considering our in and out groups, to work with clients in those in and out groups? And we get into this a little bit more with the multicultural and social justice competencies and things like that, being a privileged or an oppressed counselor versus, I don't say versus, but working with a marginalized or privileged client, and the ways that those dynamics make a difference. And so this is definitely something that we can continue to talk about, and I think is really important. Exercise 1.2 I really like as well. It's taking some time to think about your identities, which you're going to be doing, right? You did it in your personal introduction video and also the first part of your portfolio assignment. And then think about working with individuals, in these different situations. So a woman seeking counseling who's recovering from violence caused by her same-sex lover. And so, how would your identities and their identities and your in-groups and out-groups and their in-groups and out-groups impact the way that you would work with that client? And so I'm hoping that maybe we'll get into some of this during our synchronous face-to-face meetings. But if not, this is definitely something that I want you to take a look at. Again, it's on page 37 at the very end of chapter 1. And so that is it for week 1. I apologize again for getting this out late, but you will see a video shortly that focuses on our readings and topics for week 2. Thank you.